Hey YouTube, welcome back. Elemental damage is bad for your build. I promise you. The problem with elemental damage, we're not talking about ideal fire damage, so I put fire damage in my build, or ideal cold damage. We're not talking about that. We're talking about this one right here. This does not belong in your build. If you have exalted elemental damage, stop being happy. Quit it. It's too small. So the most generic modifiers in the game, they're generic, they apply to lots of things, but they roll numerically very, very low. The most specific modifiers in the game are very, very big to reward you for having the most specific damage type possible. So for example, this one here, this is % increased elemental damage. I can't think of a build where I would want this on my gear. I'd rather have something else. And if you really twist my arm and tell me that this is technically right, it's probably not a good build. Or you should go stats instead. But let's go back to this first. Elemental damage. Let's look at a staff. Tier 5. Elemental damage. This is 144% damage. Let's say that you're playing a spell. Spell is pretty generic, but it's technically less generic than elemental because elemental could apply to ailments as well. So this is elemental goes up to 144. And let's take a look at, let's go cold damage here, which is slightly more specific. This goes to 192, which is 50% increased damage over that. I said spell a second ago. Let's go take a look at spell as well. Spell goes to 192. So it is the same specificity as cold damage. And the most specific, I actually don't think you can, you can get on staves. Look at this. The most specific is elemental damage over time. This kind of rewards you for playing the most specific thing, for playing the Ignite, for playing Cold Maelstrom or Cold Werebear kind of things. It goes all the way up to 352. Look at this, tier 7 modifier. Tier 7 goes to 704, whereas tier 7 on elemental damage only goes to 288, which is a mid-roll of increased elemental damage over time. If you're playing an elemental damage over time build, you really don't want elemental damage. Let's go take a look at a ring, because this is the other place where you might consider doing one of these things. So let's play, you're playing a poison, this is kind of weird, but I was playing a poison spell build recently, so I'm gonna put this in. So let's go poison damage here, and let's go spell damage and then poison damage like this. So these are the same specificity, 60 and 60 for your tier 5 modifiers. So let's say that you're playing a fire damage build, okay? So fire damage can be the same kind of thing. Put 60 there. And then for our example, let's say that we go elemental damage, right? The elemental damage only goes up to 45. And like, even if it's exalted, it goes from 55 to 70, which is still basically a tier 5 fire damage modifier. If you're playing a fire damage build, chances are you're a spell build. You want spell damage instead of elemental build. You might be an ignite build, in which case you're doing elemental damage over time, in which case it's much, much better to do elemental damage over time. If you twist my arm and you find the most niche scenario where I'm doing this and I'm doing this and I want to do these two things, first of all, don't scale 2 elements at the same time. Thank me later. But second of all, if you're really going to do something outlandish, if you're really going to spend your time trying to tell me that there's a build out there that maybe exists, technically, I would say you might want to do this instead. So something like strength, probably, or intelligence or whatnot, will give you 4% increased damage per point. It's lower. It'll be lower than the % increased elemental damage, but it gives you something else as well. So strength in particular would give you % increased armor, which has other returns for it. You can't get a vitality on a ring, but things like maybe attunement, maybe they scale some other portion of your build. Hopefully, if you're really hurting for the types of prefixes that you put in your character, hopefully there's an attribute that can help scale something else at the same time. Because at the point where elemental damage is the best modifier for you, you'd rather just use a unique ring or use something else instead. I'm gonna read Twitch chat. I think that's about it. I'm gonna say one more thing real quick. Let's go like this and go like this. All right. The last question that we're going to talk about here is spell damage, cold damage. We'll use this as an example, but it goes the case for any kind of increased damage modifiers. When you're talking about Last Epoch, and this is the same case for Path of Exile as well, all of the increased modifiers that apply to your character are all lumped into the same bucket. So spell damage or cold damage, assuming that both of them apply to your build, they're both exactly the same. They don't go in different buckets. Like this is not a more multiplier, that's not a more multiplier. No, they all get lumped together, and that is the increased damage that applies to your entire build. I think that about covers it. This should be straightforward, but I still get questions about it. Don't put elemental damage in your build. There's probably something better instead.